Welcome to When Women Preach. This podcast exists to empower AAPI and Latina women faith leaders. It was created and is hosted by Isaac, the innovative space for Asian American Christianity. My name is Cris Otonari, and we're also here with our co-founder and CEO of Isaac, as well as the founder of this podcast, young Lee Hertig. Our guest for this episode is Alex Choi, who also happens to be one of our panelists for the Thriving Congregations Initiative program. Welcome, Alex. We're so excited to have you on our show today, and thank you for taking time out to be with us.
Thank you. I'm excited as well to just talk about ministry and feel honored.
Yeah, well, let's talk about what you've been doing. So you've planted in downtown Los Angeles in the past. You've also served as an executive pastor in Portland. And now you've planted another church called Prodigals in LA. And each of these cities have kind of distinct cultures, challenges, demographics. So can you maybe tell us what are some of the different contexts? What have they taught you about meeting people where they are?
Well, Sovereign Grace was the church I started in 2006. And initially, it was a very multi-ethnic congregation. Our leadership was multi-ethnic. The congregation was. In about year 7 or 8, it shifted drastically to an Asian American community. And so even within that church, I felt, and also because of the transient nature of young people, I felt like my 13 years there, I pastored 4 distinct churches.
Wow.
Then I moved to Portland in 2020 at the height of the pandemic. And I remember one friend actually saying, "Hey, there's a lot of white people there. Are you sure you're ready?" And I was like, my parents, they always moved to predominantly white neighborhoods. Uh, so we lived in Woodland Hills. We lived in the 80s. We lived in Glendale in the late 80s and La Cañada in the early 90s. And so I was like, oh no, I've been around white people my whole life, but it was a whole different experience there. I would say the congregation was generally older, probably between the ages of 40 and 70 was like a good chunk of the demographic. And also it was different because Portland is a city. It's a very thriving, beautiful, wonderful city. But it's the first time I lived in a city where the rural America was so close to the city. So whereas we have our suburbs, and then you got to go way out, to like Ukaipa before it gets rural. It's like a 15-minute drive to be in rural Oregon. And so that was another layer of kind of realizing I'm part of a different community. And then I came back to LA last year, and kind of like the post-pandemic Los Angeles, which feels very different. And what I'd say about like meeting people where they are, what I learned in all 3 contexts um, was the key is to meet them, period. In other words, I mean, I may be speaking from an extroverted perspective. I enjoy people. I'm extremely social, but I found no other substitute for just meeting with people.
Mm.
And I remember I learned this about myself through uh, at our first church plant. A gentleman was like, "Hey, I was part of a church plant in New York. We couldn't get past 25 people. How did you guys break from 25 to 50, 50 to 100? How did you do that?" And I was like, I have no idea. I don't know. And then one of our lay leaders said, "I know. Can I answer the question?"
Oh, how cool.
And I was kind of like, "Oh, I wonder what he's going to say." And then he said, like when Alex speaks, it feels like he's talking to you. So no matter how large the crowd, it feels like he's talking to you. And he was like, "Yeah, no, my pastor is just like that. He's like, he's a good speaker, and he's very personable in his preaching." And he goes, "No, I'm not done yet." And Alex he doesn't just sound like he's talking to you. He's literally with people all week long, you know? And so I think the meeting people where they at, for me, was always about meeting with people. And I would say 2 things in that particularly grabbed my attention is their story and the questions that they have. Like I for some reason have um, a capacity just to really hone in on their story. I think
Mhm.
everybody has an interesting story. I have not met a boring person to date, you know. I don't think there's such thing as a boring person at all.
But people don't believe that, right? Like, a lot of people think they don't have a story.
Yes, yes. And and I think it's because some of it is like they're either humble or they're insecure or
Mhm.
they genuinely don't think there's anything interesting about their story. But I think for me, I like to reflect back a lot what I find interesting about their story. And I
Mhm.
think that process has helped draw out more of their story. And then also just like paying attention to the questions that they have. It's
Mhm.
very rare that I won't ask qualifying questions about their questions because I think I always operate on the assumption that it takes about 7 to 9 tries to fully
Mm.
articulate what you're asking, you know?
Mhm.
And so, I mean, there are times where I just take it at face value, but in general, if I'm healthy, well rested, fed, I'm going to probe um, because the question that is stated is very rarely the question being asked. And so I would say, and then from there, like once I'm like locked in on a part of their story, and I have insight into the questions that they have or the questions of people in their lives, then I
Mhm.
kind of move into other principles of meeting people where they are. So for me, like one big part, maybe it's because I preach for a living. I think meeting people where they're at, one of the most important steps is learning how to speak in a way that they can connect with the church. So very, very conscious of language. In fact,
Mhm.
all of our Sunday services for 13 years, the number one question we lead out with is, did anyone say anything from the stage that wouldn't make sense to somebody that wasn't a Christian? You know? And so it
Mm.
was found that words really, really, really matter. Choice of words, construction of words. And so and I think like another thing that it helped me do is by diving into the stories of people and the questions that they have. I have this really strange habit of so meeting people where they're at. Like I'm a church planner, so you don't have people. So it's like it's actually hard to meet people where they're at because they're not there. So I had to learn the art of preaching, meeting people where they at by talking to people who aren't in the room. And it was so awkward for our church plants. I mean, like there'll be like 12 of them. I know all of them. They're like some of them are my friends. And I would say things like, and those of you who are Buddhists, and they were like, who's he talking to right now? And I'd say things like, and those of you who have same-sex attraction. And so anyways, at one point they would pull me aside and say, like, what are you doing? They're like, we're like 90% of us are married in heterosexual relationship. What are you talking about same-sex attraction? And I said, if I don't speak to the gay person, you'll never think to bring a gay person. If I don't speak to the Buddhist, you would never think to bring a Buddhist. And so for me, there's a sense in which like meeting them where they're at is often, and again, I'm talking about like building churches through a teaching ministry, which is, so what I'm saying is very particular, but it was one of the ways I had to do it. So as I glean and I listen to what, not just the stories of people, but the stories that they're telling about the people in their life, I'm like gathering all that information to try to build a ministry that will meet them where they're at.
Alex,
Because
if
yeah,
I may jump in, I think more than just anybody can tell story, but I think the way you tell story and how they inspire people, the listeners, for example, TCI participants, they can get enough of you. Another element that you are not naming is the way you carry yourself, your authenticity, I think really attract them because you are brutally honest and you are not performing, you are not pretending. So that's why your storytelling is so compelling. That's what I observed.
Oh, that's encouraging to hear because there is a natural side. I think ever since I was little, I enjoyed storytelling, but it feels like a combination of nature and nurture.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because if you're just telling your story, I mean, there's no difference between me and an entertainer. But I think it moved into a ministering to people through story,
Mm-hmm.
I think that happened through nurture. Like I had to really do inner work and deep work.
Mm-hmm.
And so what you're saying is encouraging me because it's the result of the people in my life that have worked with me through that, you know,
Mhm.
to make
Yeah,
that story.
yeah. So your hard work at yourself, your inner work, really comes through as we are with you and learning from you and your stories.
And I would add that it's rare with lead pastors and church planters. I always think of entrepreneurs, who have to worry a lot about the metrics and, building a church from nothing pretty much. And so it could be very easy to just kind of go into business mode and forget all of the important things about doing pastoral ministry, which it sounds like you have just wonderful gifts in. So I'm encouraged to hear that because having been at a few churches on staff and, hearing from the people who are a little bit lower on the totem pole or from the congregants who they don't have that connection with not only the lead pastor, but with some of the other pastors as well in the
Mm-hmm.
larger churches. And that makes such a difference. When my church, we tend to get a lot of people that have been wounded by the church or, have had not so great experiences. And a lot of them, will tell me that, well, I reached out and I never heard back, or,
Mm-hmm.
they didn't know me. I was pretty much invisible. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I hope you feel very encouraged in your work.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about one of your specialties. You specialize in helping churches navigate leadership transitions, which is super important role. And as I'm sure you know, many women of color in ministry face unique challenges when stepping into transitions between leadership roles, whether it's resistance, isolation, imposter syndrome. So, from your consulting work, what patterns have you noticed about healthy transitions? And what advice would you give to women of color who are either stepping into new leadership or helping their congregations through change?
One thing I would say, and that is transitions have to be prepared for. Like there's actually a lot of preparation
Mm-hmm.
to make transitions happen. But again, like pastors, we feel guilty telling our board we're going to step down or that we feel like right. So anyway, there's all these different emotions that go into a pastor stepping down, but preparation is key. So when I was in Portland, our founding pastor and lead pastor was getting ready to step down after 25 years of ministry. And I was like, we better hire a consultant. And they're like, well, we can't afford it. And I was like, we can't afford to not do it, you know? And the consultant came and he specializes in succession planning. My uh, first day we met with him, I went home and told my wife, I did every transition wrong, you know? Um, and I'll give you like two really important, like aspects of transition. So preparation and planning is so important. And in fact, this is unique to churches. Most companies, they already have a plan for succession, you know, but churches are the only organizations that are like, whoa, what are we going to do? Who's going, it's like everybody gets spun out and then you're making decisions in a very emotionally charged state,
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
which I would say is another thing about transition, is answer the hardest questions before you get there. So it's like almost like anticipate what is likely to happen and then make those decisions now, because when you're in the thick of it, it's too hard to decide, right? So like one example of that was we had two campuses, and one of them, they were considering going independent. And so I said, hey, before the senior pastor steps down, let's decide what are we going to do with the building that is under the mother church's name,
Mm.
um, in case that church should want to break out of the association.
Mm.
And I said, let's make this decision when we like each other, not when we're wondering why you're leaving the association, you know? And
That's
I
great.
felt like, and then they ended up breaking time. Anyways, but all of that was smoother because of the insight I got from this consultant. It was really, and I would also say in transition, it's really important to hold space for grief and
Mm.
also create space for celebration. Being a child of immigrants, I was old school. When you leave, you get out quick. You don't get in the way. You leave quietly, you leave quickly. And I did that. And what I didn't realize is that I left a lot of people hurt, in my mind, trying to do the right thing, you
Mm-hmm.
know? So there was no grief. There was no celebration because I was like, nobody's going to celebrate. In fact, my last Sunday at the church I planted, I bought the church lunch because I was like, I should be thanking you, you know? But again, I don't regret doing that. But I realized there was also this oldest child syndrome of don't celebrate me, don't celebrate me. Don't grieve me and don't celebrate me. Let's move on,
Mm.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I watched the consultant, like, step by step walk the church through grief, but also walk them through celebration. And I think that made a really, really big difference. Another one is, and this is not always possible, it's not always possible, but whenever it is to really make sure that there's a good relationship between the predecessor and successor. You know, I
Mm-hmm.
think the better that relationship is, the higher probability of success in transition. Again, you can't
Mm.
always have it. Sometimes a transition happens because of moral failure or hurt or conflict, which is unfortunately a lot of the times. But if it's not, then I think there should be some overlap, you know, kind of like an off ramp and an on ramp. I think
Mm-hmm.
the off ramp for the predecessor should be longer than you think, and the
Mm.
on ramp for a successor should be longer than you think. So my advice, nobody takes this advice, by the way, but I say it all the time because of what I learned from this consultant. I don't think a new pastor should preach the first 90 days.
Oh.
I think they should just meet with people. How are you going to preach a sermon to a people you don't know?
Mm-hmm.
And so I would say gain about 30 pounds. You're going to have a lot of meals, we'll get you gym membership, hire you a personal trainer, but it should just be meeting people the first 90 days. Meet the staff,
Mm-hmm.
meet the leaders, meet the congregation members,
Mm-hmm.
and get a sense. Because I think not only is it good for preaching, it's good for decision making and leadership, and just to because a healthy transition will always be this impossible balance of honoring the past and making the changes necessary for future health, right? And so that balance doesn't you comes through time put in with people, so that the consequences of the decisions and the changes you want to make. So I don't think you should wait 5 years before you make change. I think you should wait till be patient with change, but make changes once you understand the consequences of those changes.
Mm.
You know, 'Cause I don't think you have to do it by timeline. I think it's more of your understanding of the congregation. You
This
know,
is very insightful, Alex, and thank you for sharing that. And I'll keep that in my mind as well.
Mm.
But my advice to our sisters who are in the thick of a transition, either in stepping away or entering in, I guess more for the people entering into a change. I think number one, again, this is a little bit of a preacher bias, but I think it's really important to construct your observations into short, pithy statements. The reason why I say that is I noticed, for example, the consultant, he met with me, I'm the executive pastor, and he's a guy from Saudi. He's like, Alex, give me one sentence about the church. Give me the church in a nutshell. I said, well, Imago Dei is a church where the easy things are hard and the hard things are easy. And he was like, I'm gonna write that down. And he wrote that down. But what I realized is when I was able to kind of almost create pithy statements, it did two things. By me saying something like that, I'm honoring what is beautiful about the church because it was very multi-socioeconomic. We had homeless people sitting next to the richest people in Oregon. And so that's the hard thing that's easy at that church.
Mm.
But then I also said, well, it's also a church where the easy things are hard. Like the books weren't balanced. There was no database system. Everything was
Mm.
disorganized. The ceiling was leaking for 10 years. Like the basics were hard, right?
Mm.
And so I think by doing that, several things happen. You honor, but also you create space for acknowledging the change that is needed,
Mm.
but in a very non-condescending way.
Mhm.
I think another thing that it does is when you're a leader coming in, you're primarily dealing with people that are like fish describing water. They can't do it. They're there. They love the church. But by coming up with these observations, you're almost helping them to understand better a church that they love. Um, I think the other one is and this is hard, but you have to quickly identify who your supporters will be, you
Mm.
know,
Very
like
wise.
who you're, and if you don't know, you don't know, but don't force it. And then don't assume that the people who hired you are going to always be your allies, you
Mhm.
know. Sometimes they hired you because they thought you're the perfect person to do what they want.
Hmm. True.
So I think it's just really important to get a lay of the land. Who has that kindred spirit? I'm an Enneagram 8. I have trust issues. And something about eights is that we're always testing people, so in general, it's a very terrible habit. My wife can't stand it, but it is beneficial in situations like this. And so I'll kind of say something a little, like just right on the edge, and just see how they respond. And, or share an observation. And, I do think it's like really important though to intentionally scan the room for supporters because when you make those hard decisions, you need to know who's going to be there to support you. I think state of the church matters. Emotionally, the hardest church to take over for a lead is a growing church, but it's the easiest of all three churches because you just have to get over your insecurity of you being the one that makes it decline. But
Mm.
actually, it's the easiest church to take over.
Hmm.
No, I'm sorry, it's the second easiest. The first easiest is a church that's in decline because they know they need change. And so you can introduce change at a higher rate. The hardest church to take over is the plateaued church.
Mm.
The plateaued church that's financially stable,
Yes.
you know, or the church of 25 people that has an elementary school and a building paid off. That's the hardest church to take over.
This is very familiar.
Yeah. And so you're saying like, so you have to also know, are we a growing church? Because that will help you adjust and level set what your transition will entail. If it's a plateaued church, that's going to be very difficult. And most people take over plateau churches. And And then if you took over a church that's in decline, I mean, just smile, be grateful, and you can do a lot of make a lot more changes in the other two situations. The last thing I would say is don't so much focus on change,
Mm.
but focus on engagement. How can I engage people? You know? And so I would say that rather than trying to focus on all the changes you want to make, it's actually focused on how to make the existing things more engaging. How do you make the volunteer training more robust? Or, you know what I mean? Like you can make those kind of almost like improvements that will help engagement. And really, honestly, I think new pastors should just focus on how to get people to serve
Yeah,
because,
like lower the bar, right? Because we make it so hard. Oh, you have to be
yeah,
here for 6 months, you have to be known, and
yes. And I think it also really, it encourages your staff because the lead person is like getting people into they're helping you recruit, you know, which a lot of staff members feel lonely because they have to go recruit people. Anyway, so it feels a little like competition within the ministries, but if the person and the people on the stage are the ones helping, it does, anyway, it's a win-win in my opinion. And you're not so
Mhm,
much focused on change. You are changing, but it's more of like, how do we improve our volunteer application process? How do we improve our volunteer experience? These are all things that low hanging fruit. And then the second step will be taken much quicker, you
mm,
know?
mm.
I really
And
appreciate you emphasizing and rhyming change and engage. Without engagement, you wouldn't even know how to change.
yes,
So
yes.
that's great. But I'd like to hear more about your new church, Prodigals. And I heard that you're going to open up in February, monthly to weekly to public. What is it that you are continuing from your previous church planting experiences, and what is it that you are not? I'm interested in hearing this new exciting church called Prodigals.
Before I answer that, I want to say something.
Mhm.
And I'm not just trying to say this to win points with sisters and women and female leaders, but I will say this. There's a very big difference between when women write questions and men. And, and I'll tell you the big difference. So every application I fill out or and our questions I'm asked to like answer, whenever women create them, I have to go into a soul searching deep inner work. And then when guys ask questions, I just have to brag and, crack jokes and whatnot. And so even when you guys sent some of the questions ahead of time, it was like 2 weeks, like it was like I had to go to my journal. I had to like think about my therapy sessions. And then I think it just speaks to the gift that God has given women to, yeah, to have people think more and dig deeper, you know? And so I really appreciate it. So all these questions you're asking, I mean, I'm like sharing answers, but it was a lot of like, uh, yeah. And so even this question of what will I carry with me and what will I leave behind, this one took me quite a bit of time to think about. I know one thing that I will take with me for sure is my seeker sensitive, but not seeker driven approach to church. So I don't
Mm.
think we ought to be driven by seekers, but I think we should be sensitive to the presence of seekers. So what that looks like, let's say in the life of worship, is we don't take anything out because we think that non-Christians would be uncomfortable with it. We just explain
Mhm,
it,
mhm.
right? And so like our church, we were like a lot of non-Christians, and we were highly, highly liturgical, and people were shocked. They thought when they came, they thought we were going to see this hip and cool service, and they're like, "This is like catechism reading every Sunday, responsive reading, hymns, communion, and all this stuff. But for me, it was like we explained everything. So that was like, we're being sensitive to the fact that people don't know what these elements are, but the elements are not dictated by the people who are seeking, but we're going to be sensitive to the people who are seeking. And so I think I will carry that. That's just in my DNA. I will do that till the end. I think also a high value of emotional health, you know, it was a big deal to me. You know, I was, one of my favorite preachers was giving a lecture on preaching and kind of talked about the importance of a secondary identity that is actually your voice in preaching. So this was Tim Keller. Tim Keller was talking about when he was in New York, he identified three leaders: the professors, I think it was like entertainment or like finance people. And he was like, which one am I going to be? And he decided, I'm going to be a professor. And so that's why he was Dr. Timothy Keller, and like, and talked like a lecturer. Right. And that was he was very good at that. And I realized, well, I don't read enough books to be like a professor. So what am I going to do? And I told myself, I'm going to be the group therapist. And so I very much, so rather than reading the LA Times or Rolling Stones or like trying to be culturally relevant, I read a lot of counseling journals. And every sermon I preached, it wasn't just trying to exegete the text, and it wasn't always even trying to exegete the culture. There are people who are really good at that. For me, it was, what is the emotion that we are confronted with in this passage, you know? And then I would look at journals, and I would Google, and I would watch YouTube, and, you know, and it was a world of emotions that I thought was really important. Um, I think another thing I carry with me is just a stubborn belief that grace is everything. Like
Mm,
gospel, grace is everything. Like grace is the only thing that changes people. And that's hard because our congregation doesn't believe that. Right? They think I want to go to a church that is going to keep me accountable and give it to me straight, or tough love. And I just don't think that works. I think that's great for behavior change, but not for heart transformation. And so
mm,
the other thing too is I will never stop just meeting with people to hear their story. You know, things that I will leave behind. Um, I hope this doesn't open up a can of worms, but I would say evangelical indoctrination. I'm leaving behind. And sorry, I'm not saying that correctly. The thing I struggled with an evangelical, being an evangelical my whole life, was I felt like God's standard for people making it to heaven was different than the church's standard for leadership. And I always have red flags when we're holier than God, you
mm,
know? And so I feel like there's a standard for leadership that is stricter than God's standard for heaven. And that really bothers me.
mm,
And so for me, what I leave behind is that standard that I believe is a product of religiosity and the need for indoctrination.
mm,
Another thing I will leave behind is what I call the posture position gap. So, for example, when I was in my evangelical conservative self, my heart was always missional and open. And so I would say I had an affirming posture, but a non affirming position. And after years of trying to live in that space, I no longer want to hold that space. I want my posture and my position to be the same. So my doctrinal stance and then my social posture, I think it should be one and the same. Because what I realize is that unlike the conservatives who were not affirming and open-minded in their posture, they hurt people on the front end. I hurt people on the back end. And so for me, let the conservatives, be honest, be straightforward. I don't think you should hurt people, but if you're going to do it, at least you're being true to yourself. But I no longer want to live in that. My posture and position are different because it was too hard to see too many people like walk them in discipleship to a place and say, now there's a wall,
Yeah.
you know,
My
I don't
God.
like that.
You know what struck me when I went and heard you when you opened up your monthly lecture series? Often I'm frustrated with Christians who play God, being so sure about what they see is the capital T truth. I think that sets fundamentalist and more open-minded Christians and willing to bring your questions. And I may not have all the answers, but at least let's see how our questions are changing. So there are many, to me, extreme right and extreme left are the same because they somehow hold absolute positions
Yes.
and lack humility of what you see may not be exactly the way God sees. So I hunger for many Christians to remain humble and just be okay to not so sure about. And that is the beauty, I think. And that's what I took away from attending your church.
And I think even if humility is too high a goal,
Mm-hmm.
I just want people to be honest,
Yeah.
just be honest that there's only one verse supporting your perspective, like, right. And you can't apply the hermeneutic that you employ to arrive at such strong convictions cannot be applied across the board. It breaks down too fast. And so I just feel like there's a lack of honesty. I do agree there's a lack of humility.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, I mean, I feel like humility is so hard that let's just try to be honest. Be honest that you feel very strongly about things that have very little information to back it up. And so I think I do want to leave behind intensity on things that God does not repeat himself. So I would like my intensity, whether it be conviction or passion or to set boundaries within the church, the intensity of those things, in my opinion, should match the repetition in Revelation. And that's sadly not the case in Christianity. We are most passionate about the things that have very little repetition in Scripture. And I find that very, very scary, you know. And again, I mean, I don't think people are trying to do bad, but it breeds a lot of unhealthy dynamics in church, namely power and exclusion being the guiding principle. And I'm very uncomfortable with that. And so the last thing I'll say, I feel I want to be careful, but not careful.
You are an 8, so.
Yeah. Like, it's like awkward for me to be like measured. I am also leaving behind a white-centric theological framework. I would say this, being a Korean American who was born and raised in LA, ministered in LA. I mean, I grew up here. My Asian American and more broadly and more specifically Korean American identity was really lost on me. Again, it was like a fish describing water. But after I moved to Portland, I was like, oh, now I know what makes me Asian. And I think that what I couldn't unsee was how white evangelicalism was, how Western it was.
Mhm.
And namely, the kind of constant either or. It pushes everything to either or. And I feel like this is where Eastern mindset is far more helpful in understanding the Bible, that was written in an Eastern language, in an Eastern context, which is, there are a lot of things that are both and. And I think that for me, the either or, it can be helpful. It's helpful far less than I think people think. I'd like to leave that behind and approach things more as a both and, you know, and yeah, and just to be open-minded, open-hearted, and to be open-handed. Um, I feel like people will see Jesus more clearly in that posture than with this constant either or, you know.
Mhm. You're
Um,
singing
eh,
my song, Alex.
Me too. I've been on a very similar journey. So
yeah,
I want to go to your church.
come on, yeah, yeah.
They serve Poro's amazing sandwich and salad.
Ooh. But
No,
Ale
yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Alex.
No, I was going to say, I mean, as much as what I'm sharing are some of what I'm saying though is aspirational. I still have work. So for example, the first talk I gave, you were there, but the second one I gave, my daughter actually called me out and said, your tone was
Mm.
much more telling us what to think than giving us room to think. And
Mm.
she's like, it's weird because you like the second talk better because you felt it was tighter and more precise as a speaker, but it also had more restraint to it, had less space to breathe, you know?
Mm.
And, so yeah, it's like, it's literally a work in progress because I couldn't even get to week 2 in trying to be the, the version of church that we're trying to be, you know? And so, yeah, a lot of work, but you know,
Well, you know what? That's why I was refreshed that you have Q&A session afterwards. And then having both and paradigm means life is not that crystal clear. Often it's messy, fuzzy, and this either or white-centric paradigm has low tolerance of that ambiguity. And having both and worldview means you're going to be okay, even when it's not crystal clear. I find many Asian Americans and women and men alike, they want everything to be orderly and crystal clear. And sometimes, to be honest, I feel like I cannot breathe. Are we
Ugh.
trying to box everything as if life is like that? Life is not. Let's leave
yeah,
some room. And it's okay, even though you don't understand everything 100%. Give the Holy Spirit some room. Yeah.
yeah. No, that's a really good word because it's, I do feel like very concerned on the left and the right.
Yeah.
Um, this like real crisis of certainty, really unhealthy obsession with being certain. And so hopefully through the work of different churches that are, reevaluating their theological convictions and how they do ministry. I'm very optimistic and hopeful the church will figure this out. We will get better at this. Thank
Yeah.
you.
It's a rare space and what people have been looking for, including myself. So thank you and congratulations.
Thank
Thank
you.
you both. Yeah, thank you
Great
both.
having you.